Now, coming up to close in Sarah's country, of course, as I said, Environment Southland has put out a report to say that they are happy with the winter grazing management that has been looked after by their aerial inspections. Intensive winter grazing continues to be under the spotlight again this winter, and it is a high-risk activity in relation to water quality. But Environment Southland inspections that have taken place this week find that we are on the right track. So to join us to talk about this further is Vice President for Southland Federated Farmers, Bernadette Hunt. Good evening, Bernadette.
Hi, Sarah.
Now, are you proud of these improvements? And what are the improvements? What do they look like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have that positive feedback back from Environment Southland. We had an awful year down here last year. The spotlight was well and truly shone on Southland right after some horrific weather, and it didn't cast us in a good light at all. Farmers were gutted to see some of the footage that appeared, and to be fair, much of that footage was not a fair reflection of what was going on. But irrespective of that, farmers haven't just kind of passed it off and said we don't have to do anything. They've lifted their game another step and really made an effort to ensure that the stuff that's going on their farm through the winter period is meeting the required standards. And I actually think they've gone a step further than that in terms of trying to help people understand what intensive winter grazing is about, why we do it, and making every effort to make sure that it's cast in the best light possible.
Has it got anything to do with just a warmer, milder winter?
Absolutely, there's a bit of that. Last year we had an extremely wet winter and that carried on right into the spring. This winter has been very kind. Having said that, there have been some pretty wet spells in parts of the province, and if people want to go looking for a bad photo, they absolutely will. So, and people driving around the countryside, will find things that they don't like the look of if they want to. So yes, definitely the weather has helped us out this year, but farmers absolutely have picked up some of the messaging that's come through, picked up the lift in standards that's been expected, and really risen to that challenge.
And what are some of those winter grazing practices that people are putting into place that you're most proud of? And, critical source areas are one that's been pumped quite heavily in advertising. But any sort of different styles of break fencing that is improving the management of it, or even how intensive the grazing has been down to levels?
Yeah, there's a few things. Definitely the critical source areas have been a big focus, so keeping the stock out of those places that get particularly wet in the bad weather. We've seen a lot more back fencing this year, particularly fencing off areas that have got wet and keeping the stock from going back to them. Another thing that we've seen a lot of is water troughs a lot closer to where the stock are grazing, so they're not having to traipse back through large parts of the paddock to get to water, which means they don't have to go back through those wetter areas. The break fences can keep them out of it. Lots of different things. Sometimes smaller mob sizes as well. We've seen places where farmers have split a grazing paddock in half to reduce the size of the mobs and reduce the competition. So it's case by case. No, I hesitate to list some of those specific things because where something is good on one farm, it might actually cause problems on another. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is that farmers are closely looking at what they're doing and making some good decisions about how to improve things on their farm, rather than looking at a list of rules or a list of requirements and just mindlessly implementing them all. They're making good, solid decisions based on what they know of their property.
And tangible information that's been put out by the industry on what good looks like. Now, talking about that, let's move to the national policy standards for fresh water that come into force in September. We spoke to Kate Scott from LandPro last week, and of course I would love to get what is the most frequently asked questions that your phone is ringing hot on.
Oh gosh, it depends whether it's coming from a farmer or from somebody else in the community, because that's the interesting thing. Farmers have been waiting for this. They were heavily involved in the consultation process. They have been watching out for it and were expecting it. These standards, though, or this regulation has massive effects right across the community, and that hasn't really been picked up and many people aren't aware of it. So the impact on every single ratepayer is going to be immense as councils try and grapple with the requirements. But from a farming perspective, the two big things, particularly for us down here, one is winter grazing and the other is about the stock exclusion requirements. They're the really big things for farmers.
Okay, and what about in terms of any runoff elements to those low-lying areas and getting your head around any of that?
So the stock exclusion, if that's what you're referring to, the stock exclusion stuff is really quite challenging. It's all based around a map, which anybody can go onto that map online, type in their address and see whether their farm has been designated as low slope or not. And interestingly, those designations have little correlation to actual low slope. So I encourage everybody to go, even if you're a hill country farm, go and have a look, because you might be unpleasantly surprised at what you see. I know of a property that's very much a hill country property, even has a ski field on it, and it's been designated low slope. There's been talk about other properties where they're going to be required to fence places where you could only get the fencing materials to those locations by a helicopter. It's absolutely nuts. And the worst thing about it is that map is part of the legislation. So even if you can go and prove that it's absolutely not low slope, the only way to get out of having to comply with this regulation, if you've been designated low slope, is for a cabinet decision to alter that map, because it's embedded in the legislation. So there's huge issues with this, and it's nonsensical.
So this desktop exercise from Wellington, basically in terms of a gradient on a topographic map and blanket it, really goes away from the original RMA's intention around the individual situations. How are you advising your Federated Farmers members in Southland to implement any of this type of thing into these new freshwater environment plans? All new names all of a sudden to get our head around, and actually take these things into consideration with lack of detail around them?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and to be fair, it's quite early days yet, although the legislation takes effect in September. But we're working pretty closely, or Federated Farmers, further up the chain from me, are working pretty closely and taking lots of these questions back to MFE for clarification. There's definitions that aren't included in the document that are pretty key to understanding what the ramifications of some of it are. In terms of the intensive winter grazing stuff, there's huge ramifications, and regional councils will have to enforce some of this stuff, and they don't yet know some of the requirements themselves. So there's a lot of work going on to clarify some of this. There's actually also a lot of work going on to look at, actually, is this even implementable, either from a regional council point of view, from a farming point of view. There's lots of things that just aren't implementable. So in terms of advice for farmers, I'd just say at this stage, watch this space. There's more information coming out all the time. The different Federated Farmers executives around the country are looking at this stuff. We're certainly looking at it very, very closely in Southland, and questioning the value of the huge amount of bureaucracy that some of this stuff's going to require. If we have to spend thousands of dollars on resource consents, and the regional council has to spend thousands of dollars enforcing them and managing them, surely we're better off spending that money on actually achieving good things than just bits of paper. So there's lots of conversations going, and lots to come, I guess, on this yet. So
on that, how can I be penalised on something that fully isn't understood?
That's a very good question. And I guess the key thing that I was thinking about this in preparation for talking to you tonight is, everyone I've spoken to about this seems to understand how nuts it is. Yet here we have this crazy piece of legislation. So we're working hard on how we help larger parts of the community to understand the ramifications of it, and get more of a discussion going. There's got to be some pushback, because it just doesn't make sense. But we haven't got it all figured out yet. So yeah, watch this space.
Thank you so much, Bernadette Hunt. And as I said in the introduction, it's people like yourself that get up every day and take on the challenges on behalf of everybody else. And of course, hopefully not having too many sleepless nights on our behalf collectively. But as you just said there, it sounds like there could have been a bit more working out before it came into force. It's absolutely it shows how rushed it was. Basically, we were complaining about the timeframes and the lack of consultation time and the lack of input from the community at the time, and that's what happens in legislation when they rush it. There you go. Thank you so much, Bernadette Hunt. And of course, that consultation process, 6 weeks over this time last year, we're over calving and lambing.
This is Sarah's Country.